Let's stay in the silent era for a little bit longer. In the previous day's program, I remarked upon how Denmark's Benjamin Christensen's film The Mysterious X, released in 1914, contained superior photographic sophistication than the films of Sweden's Victor Sjostrom, namely Ingeborg Holm was the example in my mind. As anyone who has viewed Sjostrom's works from the early or mid 1910s, and especially if you've viewed Ingeborg Holm, can realize Sjostrom's work is of narrative sophistication, and they are sophisticated and extremely considered for this era of filmmaking, far more so than The Mysterious X, for example. The Mysterious X almost certainly trumps it in regard to cinematography, though. Nevertheless, I have to admit I felt a little bit bad for using Sjostrom as a negative comparison because it obviously reaches a stage where Sjöström's film craftsmanship was soaring above nearly anyone else in Europe. I mean, momentarily. Who could possibly compete with the Phantom Carriage in 1921? In reference to film construction, very little. In lieu of film storytelling and narrative construction, well, the Phantom Carriage is in a class of its own for the early 1920s and perhaps the entire decade. It contains the absolute prototype for all the Bergman and Bergman-esque archetypes for the remainder of the 20th century. This monumental work was one of the greatest pioneers in visual effects and boasted a complex narrative to boot. Its aesthetics are masterly. It commands stage cinematography, the dynamic of light and dark, with very few precedents to follow off. The Phantom Carriage was adapted from Selma Lagerlof's novel Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness. Sjostrom had previously directed three adaptations of Lagerlof's literature, the last from The Stormy Croft in 1917, Sons of Ingmar in 1919, and Karin, Daughter of Ingmar in 1920, the latter two being a duology adapted from the same source novel. Sjostrom, desiring to move away from the previous rural dramas, suggested to Lagerlof that he adapt Thy Soul Shall Bear Witness due to its urban setting and starkness, narratively. Lagerlof was concerned whether a film could adapt a narrative containing elements of the cult or supernatural, whether this could be realized in film, but Sjostrom was ready for the challenge. He penned the screenplay for The Phantom Carriage and pitched it to Lagerlof in 1920. He allegedly spent 2 hours performing the script for her, after which she expressed her approval by offering to get him dinner, according to Sjostrom. I shall describe the first quarter of the narrative only, the initial 35 minutes of its runtime, because to recite this entire fairly elaborate synopsis would be like recounting all of the events within a novel during a discussion on said hypothetical novel. Why bother? Just read the novel. The first 10 minutes of the film concerns the dying nurse Edith. She expresses a final wish, to speak with one David Holm. The next 10-minute stretch, we are introduced to David Holm, portrayed by Sjostrom himself, drinking in a cemetery with two other men. He recounts to them how, on every New Year's Eve, tonight being that very night, the last person to die in that year must assume the role of death, driving a carriage and collecting lost souls for the next year. Very strangely, the man who relayed to David this legend was his old friend Georges, who had died the previous New Year's Eve. A colleague of Edith's finds David Holm in the graveyard, attempting to persuade him to visit Edith. David angrily refuses, and is left alone, but David's two drinking buddies implore him afterward that he really ought to visit Edith. He angrily rebuffs them also. Eventually, a physical fight breaks out between the three, and David is hit with a glass bottle. His companions scatter. And so, death comes to visit. And David, soul rising from his corpse, recognizes the grim spectre as his old friend, Georges. And so what follows is a lesson from the supernatural, as Georges explains how it was he, himself, who, as a mortal, had led David wrong. He illustrates this through the first of several flashbacks. As you gather, this is a truly inspired narrative, a rare silent film attempting to soar beside the complexities then more commonplace within a novel, say. The screenplay, coupled with the visual splendor and specification, communicates multi-dimensional characters and their curious connections. Their relationships are complex and multifaceted. Much like a philosophically charged novel, the players in this film are very defined characters who move the plot forward. Individuals like Georges and Edith are treated as legendary catalysts for events, summations of certain human characteristics, vice and virtue respectively in this particular case. A few words on the visual effects. The use of double exposure here was completely legendary and innovative. From what I can understand, prior to the 1930s, all double exposure in filmmaking required creation inside the camera itself, because optical printing was not invented until the early 1930s. Whereas ordinarily, the process of optical printing entails celluloid double exposure being accomplished through one or more film projectors mechanically linked to a movie camera, allowing filmmakers to rephotograph one or more strips of film. Prior to this, optical effects had to be created inside the camera itself. Given the double exposure in the Phantom Carriage is used to illustrate transparent ghosts, this was a beautiful opportunity to experiment with moving three-dimensional objects filtered in front of the foreground, although appearing to move from the distance of said foreground image into its center. This narrative device, these transparent ghostly figures, allowed for a coherent means to explore this technological possibility within a palpable plotline. So a true pioneer in VFX. Its profound storytelling ability, its direction, cinematography, writing, and editing served as an insurmountable influence on many gigantic film directors, most notably, of course, Ingmar Bergman, who later cast Sjostrom in the structurally reminiscent Wild Strawberries. Stanley Kubrick's The Shining makes an obvious homage, and more contemporary to its release, I suspect Fritz Lang's 1922 outing Destiny is at least as indebted to this picture as it is to Griffith's Intolerance. Well, maybe not quite as much, but that's Intolerance we're talking about then. This is truly one of the most narratively powerful works of the silent era, and its filmmaking is simply enrapturing. The Phantom Carriage contains countless remarkable images, enunciating its dramatic metaphysical treatise as a work of profound relevance, beauty, and palpable for posterity. Certainly one of the great classics of film art. I've linked an upload of this film in the video description, ripped from a Criterion DVD, so the quality is very reasonable. If you haven't seen it, do give it a spin. Otherwise, if you have, I don't think I'm informing you of anything you aren't already aware of when I waffle on about this picture's glory. Victor Sjostrom was magnificent.